Most people believe attraction begins with attention, with compliments, with obvious interest, with signals that clearly say, "I want you." But some of the most powerful forms of attraction begin in a completely different way. Not with attention, but with indifference. Person enters the room. They are not trying to impress anyone. They are not chasing approval. They are not searching for validation. They simply exist within their own space, calm, self-contained, emotionally unaffected by the reactions of others. And strangely, that very indifference begins pulling attention toward them. People start noticing them, watching them, trying to understand them, because something about their presence feels different, feels unattached, and the human mind reacts strongly to unattached energy. Because when someone does not appear emotionally dependent on the attention of others, the brain interprets that behavior as a signal of internal strength. But the psychology goes even deeper than that. Indifference creates something extremely powerful inside the observer: curiosity. And curiosity is the beginning of desire. When someone appears too interested, the mind quickly understands the situation. But when someone appears indifferent, the brain begins asking questions. Why don't they seem interested? What are they thinking? Why do they seem unaffected? What would it take to capture their attention? These questions begin activating the mind's reward system, because the brain is naturally drawn toward emotional puzzles. And indifference turns a person into a puzzle, which means attention begins focusing on them automatically. The observer starts thinking about them more often, watching their reactions, trying to understand their behavior, and slowly curiosity begins transforming into attraction. But here is where the psychology becomes more complex, because indifference does not only create curiosity, it also creates emotional tension. And emotional tension is one of the most powerful ingredients behind desire. Human beings are constantly evaluating value. Every interaction we experience passes through an unconscious psychological filter. The brain quietly asks questions such as, is this person interested in me? Do they value my attention? Are they emotionally available? Or are they difficult to reach? These evaluations happen extremely quickly, often within seconds, and they strongly influence attraction. When someone shows immediate and obvious interest, the brain categorizes the interaction as predictable. Predictability creates comfort, but comfort alone rarely creates intense attraction, because intense attraction usually involves psychological challenge, a sense that something must be discovered, understood, or earned. Indifference introduces exactly this kind of challenge. When someone behaves in a way that suggests they are emotionally independent, the brain interprets their attention as something valuable. Because attention that is freely given to everyone feels ordinary, but attention that appears selective feels meaningful. This is why people who appear slightly detached often become psychologically intriguing. Their attention feels rare, and rarity increases perceived value. The observer begins wondering what it would take to receive that attention, what it would take to break through the emotional distance. And this desire to overcome emotional distance creates psychological engagement. The mind becomes invested in the interaction. which means the person displaying indifference begins occupying mental space inside the observer's mind. But the deeper psychological mechanism behind this process is something called perceived autonomy. Perceived autonomy occurs when someone appears emotionally self-sufficient. They do not seem desperate for approval. They do not appear dependent on external validation. They behave as if their emotional stability exists independently of other people's reactions. And autonomy creates attraction, because emotional independence signals internal strength. The brain interprets emotional independence as a form of psychological power, and power naturally attracts attention. But indifference alone does not create desire. Indifference combined with occasional emotional warmth does. When someone appears mostly detached but occasionally reveals genuine attention or interest, the emotional contrast becomes extremely powerful. The observer experiences a sudden shift in emotional energy, from uncertainty to connection, from distance to closeness. This contrast activates the brain's reward system, and the brain begins associating the person with emotional stimulation, which slowly transforms curiosity into desire. Neuroscience offers another explanation for why indifference can create powerful attraction. The brain releases dopamine most strongly when rewards appear unpredictably. Predictable rewards create comfort, but unpredictable rewards create excitement. Indifference creates unpredictability. The observer never knows exactly when the other person will show attention. When warmth appears unexpectedly, the emotional reward feels stronger. And stronger emotional rewards create stronger psychological attachment. This is the same reward pattern used in gambling machines. Not every action produces reward. But when reward appears unexpectedly, the brain becomes more motivated to pursue it. And in relationships, this pattern can create intense emotional engagement. The observer keeps seeking moments of connection, hoping for another moment of attention, another moment of warmth, another sign that the emotional distance has been temporarily crossed. And each time that moment appears, the attachment deepens, which is why indifference can sometimes feel more powerful than obvious attraction, because the brain becomes invested in the emotional puzzle, trying to understand the person who appears so unaffected. And that mental investment gradually strengthens desire. When someone behaves with subtle indifference, something unusual begins happening inside the mind of the other person. Attention increases, not because the indifferent person is doing more, but because they are doing less. Human psychology is deeply sensitive to emotional gaps. When communication feels incomplete, the brain automatically attempts to fill the missing information. If someone expresses strong interest, the emotional message becomes clear. But when someone appears calm, detached, or slightly distant, the brain cannot easily interpret their emotional state. And uncertainty activates the mind's analysis system. The observer begins asking silent questions. Do they like me? Are they simply confident? Are they hiding their interest? Why are they not reacting the way most people react? These questions create mental loops, and mental loops increase attention. The more the brain tries to understand someone, the more that person begins occupying space inside the mind. At first, this attention feels like simple curiosity, but curiosity has a unique psychological property. When curiosity is left unresolved, it slowly turns into obsession. Because the brain does not like incomplete patterns. The human mind constantly seeks emotional closure. When something feels unresolved, attention continues returning to it again and again. This is why mysterious people often remain memorable. Not because they did something dramatic, but because they left questions unanswered. Indifference creates exactly this type of unanswered emotional question, and the mind becomes fascinated by unanswered questions. But the effect becomes even stronger when indifference is paired with occasional emotional signals. Imagine someone who is calm, distant, and independent most of the time, but occasionally they show warmth, a genuine smile, a brief moment of emotional openness, a moment where their attention feels completely present. That sudden warmth becomes powerful because the brain interprets it as a reward, and rewards that appear after emotional distance feel more intense. The observer begins associating that person with emotional highs, moments of connection that feel rare and valuable. This reward pattern activates a powerful neurological mechanism. The brain begins chasing the emotional reward, just like a puzzle that suddenly reveals a small piece of its solution. The mind wants to solve the rest, and solving the emotional puzzle means gaining more access to the person who seems slightly unreachable. Mystery plays a powerful role in attraction, but mystery is not created by hiding everything. True mystery comes from controlled emotional exposure. Indifference naturally creates this effect, because someone who is comfortable with themselves does not constantly reveal their thoughts. They do not rush to fill silence. They are not trying to prove their value. And this calm, emotional restraint creates psychological intrigue. The observer begins studying their behavior, watching small details, how they respond to conversations, how they react to tension, how they carry themselves in social situations. Every small signal begins feeling meaningful because the observer is searching for clues that reveal what lies behind the emotional distance. And this investigation creates psychological investment. The observer becomes emotionally involved long before they realize it. Their mind returns to the person again and again, not because the person is aggressively pursuing attention, but because they are not. This is the paradox of indifference. The less someone tries to control attention, the more naturally attention moves toward them. But this only works when the indifference is authentic. False indifference often appears forced. People can sense when someone is pretending to be uninterested. True indifference comes from internal stability, from someone who genuinely feels comfortable within themselves, someone who does not depend on external approval to feel secure. That emotional independence creates a calm energy, and calm energy is extremely attractive because it signals emotional strength. But there is another deeper psychological effect happening beneath the surface, and it explains why indifference can sometimes create extremely strong attraction. Human perception of value is heavily influenced by scarcity. Things that are easily available feel ordinary. Things that appear rare feel valuable. Indifference creates the perception of scarcity, not because the person is unavailable, but because their emotional attention appears selective. They are not reacting strongly to everyone. They are not chasing validation. They are not constantly seeking approval. Their attention feels intentional, and intentional attention feels rare. The observer begins thinking, if this person rarely shows interest, then their interest must mean something, and that thought increases the perceived value of their attention, which means receiving their attention becomes emotionally rewarding. The observer wants to earn it, which deepens psychological engagement. But there is an even deeper layer to this phenomenon, because indifference also interacts with a powerful psychological trigger known as ego activation. When someone appears unaffected by our presence, our ego sometimes reacts. We begin wondering why they are not responding to us the way others usually do. And this curiosity becomes personal. We start wanting to influence their perception, to make them notice us, to make them respond. This ego activation strengthens attraction, because now the interaction is no longer neutral. It becomes a challenge, and challenges are emotionally stimulating, which means indifference can unintentionally turn attraction into a psychological game, where the observer becomes more invested than the indifferent person ever intended. Attraction rarely grows inside emotional comfort. Most powerful attraction grows inside emotional tension. Tension is the invisible psychological space between two people where something is felt but not fully expressed. It is the pause between curiosity and certainty, the distance between interest and confession. And indifference naturally creates this emotional tension, because when someone remains calm, composed, and slightly detached, the emotional dynamic becomes uneven. One person begins wondering, watching, analyzing, while the other person appears unaffected. This imbalance of emotional investment is what generates tension. And tension is psychologically stimulating. The human brain becomes more alert in emotionally uncertain situations, because uncertainty activates attention. The mind tries to read subtle signals, small expressions, tone of voice, body language. Even silence begins carrying meaning. Every moment becomes psychologically charged, and this heightened awareness makes the interaction feel intense, even if very little is actually happening. Indifference therefore amplifies emotional perception. The observer begins interpreting ordinary behavior as meaningful. A simple glance suddenly feels significant. A short message feels important. A brief smile feels powerful. Because when emotional signals are rare, they appear more valuable. And this psychological magnification increases attraction. But there is another mechanism operating beneath the surface, and it explains why indifference sometimes creates emotional addiction. The human mind naturally seeks closure. When something feels incomplete, the brain continues returning to it. Unfinished stories remain in memory longer. Unanswered questions stay in our thoughts. This is known in psychology as the Zeigarnik effect. Unfinished experiences remain mentally active. Indifference creates exactly this kind of unfinished emotional experience, because the observer never fully understands where they stand. Is the person interested? Are they simply confident? Are they emotionally distant? Or are they hiding their feelings? The uncertainty leaves the interaction unresolved, and unresolved emotions keep the mind engaged. The observer begins replaying conversations, thinking about small details, wondering what certain behaviors meant, trying to decode emotional signals. Each attempt to understand the situation strengthens the mental connection, because thinking about someone repeatedly increases emotional familiarity, and familiarity slowly deepens attraction, even when the attraction began from curiosity alone. But emotional tension becomes even more powerful when the indifferent person occasionally reveals glimpses of genuine connection. A brief moment of warmth, a meaningful conversation, a moment where emotional distance suddenly disappears. These moments feel intense because they temporarily resolve the tension, but only for a short time. And when the emotional distance returns, the mind wants that moment again, which creates a cycle: distance, curiosity, connection, distance again. This cycle can quietly build strong emotional attachment, even if the relationship itself is not deeply developed, because the emotional experience feels powerful, and powerful emotions create lasting memories. But the psychology of indifference also reveals something about human nature. It shows that people are not only attracted to affection, they are also attracted to emotional challenge, because challenge activates the desire to be chosen. When someone appears indifferent, their attention feels selective, which means receiving that attention feels meaningful, almost like a small victory, and victories feel rewarding. But here is the dangerous side of this dynamic. Sometimes attraction created by indifference has very little to do with genuine compatibility. The attraction may come primarily from the psychological tension itself, the mystery, the emotional uncertainty, the mental puzzle. And once the puzzle is solved, the emotional intensity sometimes disappears, because the attraction was never only about the person. It was about the psychological experience. This is why relationships built entirely on emotional tension can feel powerful at first but unstable later. When the mystery disappears, the emotional reward system becomes quiet, and the connection must then survive on deeper qualities: respect, compatibility, shared values, emotional maturity. Without those foundations, the attraction created by indifference can slowly fade. But when indifference is simply a natural expression of emotional independence, something healthier happens. The attraction grows without manipulation, without emotional games, because the indifference is not strategic. It is simply the result of someone who already feels complete within themselves. And emotional completeness is one of the most attractive traits a person can possess, because people are drawn toward those who do not depend on others for emotional stability. It creates the feeling of psychological safety, a sense that this person is grounded, balanced, unmoved by small emotional fluctuations. And grounded people naturally become anchors in social environments. Others feel calmer around them, more stable, more secure, which means their presence becomes quietly powerful, not because they try to attract attention, but because their emotional independence naturally commands it. At this point, something important becomes clear. Indifference does not create attraction because it is cold. It creates attraction because it signals emotional self-sufficiency. And emotional self-sufficiency is rare. Most people enter relationships carrying an invisible need for validation. They want to feel desired. They want reassurance. They want emotional confirmation that they matter. But when someone appears calm without needing constant emotional feedback, their behavior disrupts the usual pattern of interaction. The observer suddenly encounters someone who seems internally stable, someone who does not chase approval, someone who does not panic when attention disappears, someone who remains composed even when the emotional atmosphere around them changes. This stability communicates something powerful. Communicates control, not control over others, but control over oneself. And psychological self-control is deeply attractive because it signals maturity. It signals inner security. It signals a person who is not easily shaken by emotional turbulence. The mind recognizes this almost instantly, even if it cannot explain why, and the result is subtle fascination. People begin watching them more carefully, listening more closely, trying to understand the source of that calm confidence. But here is where the dynamic becomes dangerous, because indifference does not always mean emotional strength. Sometimes it hides emotional unavailability, and emotional unavailability can create a powerful psychological trap. When someone appears distant but occasionally offers warmth, the observer experiences alternating emotional states: distance, hope, connection, distance again. This emotional rhythm creates strong psychological conditioning because the brain begins associating the person with emotional intensity. Each moment of connection feels rewarding. Each moment of distance creates anticipation, and anticipation strengthens emotional focus, which means the observer becomes increasingly invested. Sometimes far more invested than the indifferent person ever intended. This is how indifference can quietly transform into emotional power. The person who appears less emotionally dependent often becomes the center of attention, because they are not competing for attention. They are simply existing without needing it. And paradoxically, that independence becomes magnetic. But healthy attraction does not rely on indifference alone. True attraction grows from something deeper: mutual emotional respect, genuine curiosity about each other, a sense that both people are choosing the connection rather than chasing validation. Indifference becomes dangerous only when it turns into emotional manipulation. When someone intentionally withholds warmth to create attachment. When attention is used as a tool to control emotional response. That dynamic can create powerful attraction, but it rarely creates healthy relationships. Because attraction based on emotional uncertainty eventually produces exhaustion. Real connection feels different. It still contains mystery. It still contains emotional tension. But it also contains honesty, presence, and mutual emotional investment. And that balance is what transforms attraction into something sustainable. Without it, indifference remains a psychological game, a fascinating one, powerful one, but ultimately unstable. And this reveals something many people misunderstand about attraction. The most powerful connections do not begin with loud signals of desire. They begin quietly, inside curiosity, inside emotional tension, inside the subtle question that forms in someone's mind when they encounter a person who seems completely comfortable within themselves. Indifference becomes dangerous not because it pushes people away, but because it silently pulls attention toward the person who does not appear to need it. And the mind is endlessly fascinated by those who seem untouched by its usual rules. But the real power in human connection does not come from controlling attraction. It comes from understanding it. Because once you understand the psychology behind attention, curiosity, and emotional tension, you begin seeing relationships with a completely different clarity. And if this insight made you look at attraction differently today, then take a moment now and subscribe to the channel, because here on Voxlore Audio, we explore the deeper psychology behind human behavior, relationships, and the hidden patterns shaping our lives. And the more clearly you understand those patterns, the more consciously you begin living them.